Six-Day War started on June 5, 1967, and was the third of the Arab-Israeli wars. Israel's decisive victory included the capture of the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, Old City of Jerusalem, and Golan Heights. The status of these territories subsequently became a major point of contention in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Prior to the start of the war, attacks conducted against Israel by fledgling Palestinian guerrilla groups based in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan had increased, leading to costly Israeli reprisals. In November 1966, an Israeli strike on the village of Al-Samu in the Jordanian West Bank left 18 dead and 54 wounded, and, during an air battle with Syria in April 1967, the Israeli Air Force shot down 6 Syrian MiG fighter jets. In addition, Soviet intelligence reports in May indicated that Israel was planning a campaign against Syria, and although inaccurate, the information further heightened tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had previously come under sharp criticism for his failure to aid Syria and Jordan against Israel. He had also been accused of hiding behind the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, stationed at Egypt's border with Israel in the Sinai. Now, however, he moved to unambiguously demonstrate support for Syria. On May 14, 1967, Nasser mobilized Egyptian forces in the Sinai. On May 18, he formally requested the removal of the UNEF stationed there, and on May 22 he closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping, thus instituting an effective blockade of the port city of Eilat in southern Israel. On May 30, King Hussein of Jordan arrived in Cairo to sign a mutual defense pact with Egypt, placing Jordanian forces under Egyptian command. Shortly thereafter, Iraq too joined the alliance. In response to the apparent mobilization of its Arab neighbors, early on the morning of June 5, Israel staged a sudden preemptive air assault that destroyed more than 90% Egypt's air force on the tarmac. A similar air assault incapacitated the Syrian Air Force. Without cover from the air, the Egyptian army was left vulnerable to attack. Within 3 days, the Israelis had achieved an overwhelming victory on the ground, capturing the Gaza Strip and all of the Sinai Peninsula up to the east bank of the Suez Canal. An eastern front was also opened on June 5 when Jordanian forces began shelling West Jerusalem, disregarding Israel's warning to King Hussein to keep Jordan out of the fight, only to face a crushing Israeli counterattack. On June 7, Israeli forces drove Jordanian forces out of East Jerusalem and most of the West Bank. Photos and films of Israeli troops taking control of the Old City of Jerusalem have proved to be some of the war's Israeli tanks advancing on the Golan Heights during the Six-Day War between Arab and Israeli forces, June 10, 1967. The UN Security Council called for a ceasefire on June 7 that was immediately accepted by Israel and Jordan. Egypt accepted the following day. Syria held out, however, and continued to shell villages in northern Israel. On June 9, Israel launched an assault on the fortified Golan Heights, capturing it from Syrian forces after a day of heavy fighting. Syria accepted the ceasefire on June 10. The Arab countries' losses in the conflict were disastrous. Egypt's casualties numbered more than 11,000, with 6,000 for Jordan and 1,000 for Syria, compared with only 700 for Israel. The Arab armies also suffered crippling losses of weaponry and equipment. The lopsidedness of the defeat demoralized both the Arab public and the political elite. Nasser announced his resignation on June 9 but quickly yielded to mass demonstrations calling for him to remain in office. In Israel, which had proved beyond question that it was the region's preeminent military power. Yomkipur War, fourth of the Arab-Israeli Wars, which was initiated by Egypt and Syria on October 6, 1973, on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. It also occurred during Ramadan, the sacred month of fasting in Islam, and it lasted until October 26, 1973. The war, which eventually drew both the United States and the Soviet Union into indirect confrontation in defense of their respective allies, was launched with the diplomatic aim of persuading a chastened, if still undefeated, Israel to negotiate on terms more favorable to the Arab countries. The Six-Day War, 1967, the previous Arab-Israeli War, in which Israel had captured and occupied Arab territories including the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, was followed by years of sporadic fighting. Anwar Sadat, who became Egypt's president shortly after the War of Attrition, 1969-70, ended, made overtures to reach a peaceful settlement if, in accordance with United Nations Resolution 242, Israel would return the territories it had captured. Israel rejected those terms, and the fighting developed into a full-scale war in 1973. A mosque in the Golan Heights damaged during the Yom Kippur War. On the afternoon of October 6, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel simultaneously on two fronts. With the element of surprise to their advantage, Egyptian forces successfully crossed the Suez Canal with greater ease than expected, suffering only a fraction of the anticipated casualties, while Syrian forces were able to launch their offensive against Israeli positions and break through to the Golan Heights. The intensity of the Egyptian and Syrian assaults, so unlike the situation in 1967, rapidly began to exhaust Israel's reserve stocks of munitions. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir turned to the United States for aid, while the Israeli General Staff hastily improvised a battle strategy. The reluctance of the United States to help Israel changed rapidly when the Soviet Union commenced its own resupply effort to Egypt and Syria. U.S. Pre. Richard Nixon countered by establishing an emergency supply line to Israel. Even though the Arab countries imposed a costly oil embargo and various U.S. allies refused to facilitate the arms shipments, with reinforcements on the way, the Israel Defense Forces rapidly turned the tide. Israel succeeded in disabling portions of the Egyptian air defenses, which allowed Israeli forces commanded by General Ariel Sharon to cross the Suez Canal and surround the Egyptian Third Army. On the Golan Front, Israeli troops, at heavy cost, repulsed the Syrians and advanced to the edge of the Golan Plateau on the road to Damascus. On October 22, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 338, which called for an immediate end to the fighting. Despite this, however, hostilities continued for several days thereafter, prompting the UN to reiterate the call for a ceasefire with Resolutions 339 and 340. With international pressure mounting, the war finally ceased on October 26. Israel signed a formal ceasefire agreement with Egypt on November 11 and with Syria on May 31, 1974. The war did not immediately alter the dynamics of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but it did have a significant impact on the trajectory of an eventual peace process between Egypt and Israel, which culminated in the return of the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for lasting peace. The war proved costly for Israel, Egypt, and Syria, having caused significant casualties and having disabled or destroyed large quantities of military equipment. Furthermore, though Israel had staved off any advance by Egypt to recapture the Sinai Peninsula during the war, it never restored its seemingly impenetrable fortifications along the Suez Canal that Egypt had destroyed on October 6. The results of the conflict thus required the two countries to coordinate arrangements for disengagement in the short term and made more immediate the need for a negotiated permanent settlement to their ongoing disputes.